Welcome to Disruptarian Radio, where we tackle the issues that challenge conventional thinking. I'm your host, Ryan Thompson, and today we're diving into a fascinating historical and economic debate, tariffs versus income tax.
And I'm Sarah Johnson, joining Ryan to unpack this critical discussion about taxation models that have shaped America's economic landscape.
Thanks for being here, Sarah. You know, most Americans have grown up in a world where income tax is just a fact of life, but it wasn't always this way. Before 1913, our nation operated quite differently.
That's right, Ryan. And with President Trump's 2025 tariff policies making headlines, this seems like the perfect time to examine the historical context and philosophical differences between these two approaches to funding government.
Absolutely. Today we'll explore not just the practical differences between these taxation methods, but also what they mean for personal liberty and economic sovereignty, concepts that were central to our founders' vision.
And I think listeners will be surprised to learn about the consistency of certain political positions over time, especially regarding tariffs, which haven't always fallen along the party lines we might expect.
Let's jump right in and explore how America functioned for over a century without reaching into citizens' paychecks, and what that might teach us about today's economic debates. It's hard for many Americans today to imagine, but for the majority of our nation's history, the federal government never asked for a portion of your paycheck. Prior to 1913, there was no federal income tax as we know it.
That's right, Ryan. From 1789 until the passage of the 16th Amendment, America primarily funded its federal operations through tariffs on imported goods. This was a fundamentally different approach to generating revenue.
And not just a little different, entirely different in both practice and principle. Instead of directly taxing citizens' earnings, the government placed duties on foreign products entering our borders. This system generated sufficient revenue to run the essential functions of government.
I think many listeners might be wondering how that was possible. Could tariffs really fund an entire government?
Well, it's important to remember that the federal government was much smaller then. But yes, for over a century, tariffs typically constituted between 80 to 90% of federal revenue, alongside some excise taxes and land sales.
And there's a fascinating historical pattern here. During wartime, like the Civil War, temporary income taxes were sometimes implemented, but Americans consistently rejected them becoming permanent until the early 20th century.
Exactly. The historical significance can't be overstated. The America that became an industrial powerhouse, that built transcontinental railroads, that began to emerge as a world power, all happened under a tariff-based revenue system, not an income tax system.
It really challenges our modern assumptions about what's necessary to fund governance, doesn't it? And it raises questions about how this shift fundamentally changed the relationship between citizens and their government.
That's the critical point. When we look at America before 1913, we're not just seeing a different tax policy. We're seeing a different conception of the proper relationship between citizens and their government. And that leads us to the libertarian perspective on this distinction. Let's explore the libertarian perspective on this crucial distinction between income taxes and tariffs. At its core, this is about more than economic policy. It's fundamentally about liberty.
I think that's a compelling framing, Ryan. From a libertarian viewpoint, income tax represents something quite troubling: direct confiscation of your labor.
Precisely. When the government claims ownership over any percentage of your paycheck, whether it's 10% or 90%, it establishes a relationship that uncomfortably resembles partial ownership of you as a person.
That's a strong statement, but philosophically sound. If someone else maintains an automatic claim on the fruits of your labor regardless of your consent, can you truly say your labor is fully yours?
Many libertarian thinkers would argue no. And this is where tariffs operate on an entirely different principle. They don't create an inescapable obligation based simply on your productivity.
Instead, tariffs apply only to specific voluntary transactions, namely the importation of foreign goods. You can legally avoid tariffs through different purchasing choices, which preserves an element of consent that income taxation lacks.
Exactly. If you choose to buy domestically produced goods, you wouldn't pay the tariff. That preservative of choice maintains a crucial element of liberty that direct income taxation simply doesn't offer.
It reminds me of the distinction between direct and indirect taxes that the founders were so concerned with. Income tax reaches directly into your pocket, while tariffs represent an indirect form of taxation.
And we should note that no taxation perfectly aligns with pure libertarian principles, but the distinction matters immensely. Income tax claims ownership over persons, while tariffs merely affect transactions.
So while both are government interventions in the economy, they differ dramatically in how they interact with individual freedom and choice.
And that's why this isn't just an academic discussion. It speaks to the very nature of our relationship with government, and how much of ourselves we're required to surrender just by virtue of being productive citizens. What's particularly fascinating about President Trump's embrace of tariffs in 2025 is that this isn't some new policy direction he's stumbled upon. This represents the continuation of views he's consistently held for nearly 4 decades.
That's right, and there's remarkable evidence of this consistency. Back in 1988, long before his political career began, Trump appeared on Oprah Winfrey's show and advocated strongly for protective tariffs.
I've seen that clip. What strikes me is that he was actually a registered Democrat at that time, telling Winfrey, "I'd make our allies pay their fair share."
In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. Reciprocal, that means they do it to us and we do it to them. Very simple. Can't get any simpler than that.
You took out a full-page ad in major U.S. newspapers last year criticizing U.S. foreign policy. What would you do differently, Donald?
I'd make our allies, forgetting about the enemies you can't talk to so easily, I'd make our allies pay their fair share. We're a debtor nation. Something's going to happen over the next number of years with this country, because you can't keep going on losing $200 billion, and yet we let Japan come in and dump everything right into our markets and everything. It's not free trade. If you ever go to Japan right now and try to sell something, forget about it, Oprah. Just forget about it. It's almost impossible. They don't have laws against it. They just make it impossible. They come over here, they sell their cars, their VCRs, they knock the hell out of our companies. And, hey, I have tremendous respect for the Japanese people. I mean, you can respect somebody that's beating the hell out of you, but they are beating the hell out of this country. Kuwait, they live like kings. The poorest person in Kuwait, they live like kings. And yet they're not paying. We make it possible for them to sell their oil. Why aren't they paying us 25% of what they're making? It's a joke.
This sounds like political presidential talk to me, and I know people have talked to you about whether or not you want to run. Would you ever?
Probably
I'm tired
not.
of watching other countries ripping off the United States.
It's almost word for word what we hear from him today. That level of consistency across nearly 40 years and through different party affiliations is quite rare in American politics.
Most politicians shift their positions based on polling data or party platforms, but Trump has maintained this economic nationalism regardless of the political winds. Even when free trade became Republican orthodoxy in the 90s and 2000s, he didn't waver.
And he faced significant pushback for it, even within his own administration during his first term. Many traditional Republicans were deeply uncomfortable with his protectionist stance.
What I find most interesting is that he wasn't just bucking Republican trends, he was actually reviving a much older American political tradition that had fallen out of favor in both parties.
And he's demonstrated a willingness to implement these views regardless of conventional economic wisdom or political pressure. Love him or hate him, that's a form of political consistency we rarely see.
It certainly challenges the common narrative that Trump simply adopts whatever position is convenient at the moment. On this particular economic issue, he's been remarkably steadfast for decades. Here's something many Americans don't realize. Supporting tariffs was actually a traditionally Democratic position throughout much of American history. From Thomas Jefferson through Woodrow Wilson, Democratic presidents and leaders generally favored tariff policies.
That's absolutely right. The Democratic Party was the party of protectionism for over a century. They championed tariffs specifically to protect American industries and workers from foreign competition.
It's quite a reversal from what we see today. Jefferson himself, though cautious about taxation generally, saw tariffs as the most appropriate way to fund the federal government while protecting domestic manufacturing.
And Andrew Jackson, one of the most iconic Democratic presidents, was a strong advocate for what they called the American system, which included protective tariffs as a cornerstone policy.
What's fascinating is how dramatically this shifted in recent decades. Beginning really in the Clinton administration, Democrats embraced free trade agreements like NAFTA, moving away from their historical protectionist roots.
That's when we saw this strange political realignment. As Democrats increasingly supported globalization and free trade, Trump maintained his protectionist stance regardless of which party he was affiliated with at the time.
It's almost as if Trump's economic nationalism is more aligned with the historical Democratic Party than with modern Republican free market orthodoxy. He's essentially reviving an old Democratic position that the party itself abandoned.
And that explains some of his appeal in traditionally Democratic strongholds like the industrial Midwest. His tariff policies resonate with voters whose families might have supported Democrats for generations, specifically because of those protectionist stances.
It's one of those political ironies that gets lost in our current polarized climate. Trump's signature economic policy actually has deeper roots in Democratic tradition than Republican ideology.
Start here. President Trump standing firm on his tariff policy, pledging that these tariffs will bring back manufacturing jobs and provide funding for tax cuts that the American people badly want. Now, China's responding with retaliatory 34% tariffs on the United States. Those are set to begin on April 10th. Meanwhile, House Democrats, this is interesting, are trying to stand in the president's way with a vote to undo his national emergency declaration, that order that will give him tariff authority. But this newfound hatred of tariffs from the left stands in stark opposition to what Democrats were saying in the past. Roll the tape.
In terms of tariffs, I think it's interesting to note that the average U.S. MFN tariff on Chinese goods coming into the United States is 2%, whereas the average Chinese MFN tariff on U.S. goods going into China is 35%. Is that reciprocal?
What they have said is that we need to not worry about manufacturing in America, because what we should establish is a policy of unfettered free trade. We don't need tariffs. What we need is to allow corporate America the freedom to throw American workers out on the street.
We had a tire case in which they were flooding us with cheap domestic tires or cheap Chinese tires. And we put a stop to it. And as a consequence, saved jobs throughout America.
Let's talk about our founding fathers for a moment. When they were establishing this new republic, they made a very deliberate choice about how to fund the federal government.
That's right. The founders specifically chose import duties, tariffs, as the primary federal funding mechanism, and this wasn't accidental. It was a philosophical decision as much as a practical one.
Alexander Hamilton, our first Treasury Secretary, established this system where virtually all federal revenue came from customs duties on imported goods. And this approach funded the government for over a century.
What's particularly interesting is their reasoning. The founders understood intuitively that direct taxation of citizens' labor created a fundamentally different relationship between the government and the governed.
Exactly. In their view, for a citizen to be truly free, they needed complete ownership of their own labor. Direct taxation was seen as the government claiming partial ownership of each person's work.
James Madison wrote extensively about this. He believed that taxation which directly claimed a portion of every citizen's productivity was incompatible with the principles of a free republic.
And we sometimes forget that the Constitution initially prohibited direct taxes unless they were apportioned among the states according to population, which made a national income tax effectively impossible.
Until the 16th Amendment in 1913, of course. But for the first 124 years of our nation's existence, the federal government operated primarily on tariff revenue. It's remarkable when you think about it.
They created a system where the government could function without reaching into every citizen's paycheck. The tariff system maintained that crucial separation between a person's labor and government claims,
which aligns perfectly with their broader vision of limited government and individual liberty. They wanted citizens to feel that their work belonged entirely to themselves, not partially to the state.
It's almost unimaginable today, but the federal system our founders created operated on roughly 3% of our current GDP. Today's massive federal apparatus could never run solely on tariff revenue.
That's the elephant in the room, isn't it? Our current federal government consumes around 20-25% of GDP annually. The scale is fundamentally different from what the founders envisioned.
And that's precisely the point. The normalization of income tax has enabled a government that would be completely unsustainable under the original model. The income tax doesn't just fund the government, it transformed what government could become.
By creating a direct claim on every American's labor, we established a system that could grow almost without limitation. When you can automatically take a percentage of the entire economy, the constraints disappear.
Which brings us back to Trump's tariff policies in 2025. What's interesting is that his return to a tariff-focused approach isn't merely a practical policy shift. It represents a philosophical realignment with earlier American principles.
Absolutely. While he's not dismantling the income tax system, his emphasis on tariffs does reconnect with those historical funding mechanisms. It's reintroducing the idea that taxation should primarily occur at the border rather than the paycheck.
And we can see this reflected in his broader economic philosophy, too. The tariff approach aligns with his emphasis on national sovereignty and economic self-determination, ideas that would have resonated strongly with many early American leaders.
It's a fascinating case of policy coming full circle. These tariff policies have deep historical roots in both parties' traditions, though they've been largely abandoned by mainstream economic thinking in recent decades.
What's ultimately at stake is a fundamental question about liberty. Can citizens truly be free if the government maintains an automatic claim on their labor? Or is a transaction-based tax system, however imperfect, more compatible with a free society?
So look, you probably won't be surprised to find that publicly, Marjorie Taylor Greene has been very supportive of Donald Trump's trade policies. She posts about it on X. She's done so repeatedly. I'll give you a taste of just a few of her posts. In one example, she writes, "America first means American workers first. These tariffs are Liberation Day for steelworkers, auto workers, and every forgotten small town. Empty factories will be full again. President Trump is bringing our economic independence back." Now, that's a common message that you'll hear from Trump supporters, certainly those closest to him and elected lawmakers as well. I'll give you some more examples. She writes, "The COVID vaccine experts and couch stock traders need to take a look at the history of the stock market. They didn't care when the stock market was down big under Joe Biden's America Last policies. This is a short-lived correction that will end up paying dividends for American workers and manufacturers across the country." Now, let me just pause and say,
We don't know the purpose of these tariffs. The only thing we do know is he's planning on taking tax revenue from Americans paying more at Walmart and Costco and putting that into tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. It's totally gross, and it's putting us on the brink of a recession. Could cost us tons of manufacturing jobs as we get into this trade war. It's a really disturbing policy. I hope he backs off.
But Kevin, he said there's a lot of deals that they're literally kissing his ass, was the phrase he used, very eloquently. Where are the deals?
104% tariffs on China are not enough. I'm advocating 400%. I do business in China. They don't play by the rules. They've been in the WTO for decades. They have never abided by any of the rules they agreed to when they came in for decades. They cheat, they steal IP. I can't litigate in their courts. They take product, technology, they steal it, they manufacture it, sell it back here. Never has an administration.
400% tariffs? What would that
I
look
want
like?
Xi on an airplane to Washington to level the playing field. It's just not about tariffs anymore. Nobody has taken on China yet, not the Europeans, no administration for decades. As someone who actually does business there, I've had enough. I speak for millions of Americans who have IP that have been stolen by the Chinese. I have nothing against the Chinese people. They brought great literacy, art, and tech to the world. The government cheats and steals, and finally, an administration, you may not like Trump, you may not like his style or his rhetoric, finally, an administration that puts up and says enough. 400% tariffs tomorrow morning. he'll tell you why. Xi can only stay the supreme leader if people are employed. If we wipe out any business there, because we are still 39% of all consumables on Earth and 25% of the world's GDP, America is the #1 economy on Earth with all the cards. We will not have that forever. It's time to squeeze Chinese heads into the wall now.
Well,
I'm
hold
not
on
talking
a
about
second,
tariffs
Kevin.
on
Well,
60
I hear you, but hold on. If we're talking about people, the average consumer, not necessarily the head honchos of businesses all across the globe, can they withstand the pressure of that sort of tax on the goods they're going to have?
short-lived. There will be
But what's your timeline compared
As we wrap up today's discussion, I think the fundamental distinction between these taxation approaches deserves emphasis. Income tax inherently claims partial ownership over persons and their labor, making the government, in effect, a silent partner in your work life, whether you consent to this arrangement or not.
While tariffs, on the other hand, affect specific transactions only, they may raise prices on certain imported goods, but they preserve your choice as a consumer and don't assert ownership over your productivity itself.
Neither system is perfect from a liberty perspective, but there's a profound difference between a tax you can legally avoid through purchasing choices and one that claims ownership of your labor regardless of your actions.
This distinction isn't just academic. It reflects fundamentally different visions of the relationship between citizens and their government.
That's the heart of what we've been exploring today on Disruptarian Radio. If you've enjoyed this discussion on taxation and liberty, I encourage you to check out our other content at Disruptarian.com, where we tackle similar thought-provoking topics each week.
You can also find Ryan's music as DJ Disruptarian on all major platforms: Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, and more.
Thanks for tuning in today. Whether you agree with our perspectives or not, I hope we've given you something meaningful to consider about taxation and liberty. For Disruptarian Radio, I'm Ryan Thompson.
And I'm Sarah Johnson. Join us next week for another disruptive conversation.
Until then, question everything and stay disruptarian.